Picture a Viking homestead nestled in a windswept fjord. Beyond the longhouse and its curling smoke, you'd see something rarely shown in movies: gardens. Rows of hardy vegetables, berry bushes against the fence, trees shaped by the wind, yet bearing fruit. While Viking ships were off exploring new worlds or raiding coastal settlements, those left behind were mastering a different kind of conquest, cultivating life in some of the harshest conditions in Europe. The popular image of Vikings as bloodthirsty raiders sailing across dark seas tells only half the story. For every warrior who wielded an axe, there were dozens more who wielded hoes, sickles, and pruning knives. The Norse civilization wasn't built on conquest alone. It was built on the patient, backbreaking work of coaxing food from frozen ground. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites across Scandinavia reveals a sophisticated agricultural system that sustained communities through brutal winters and unpredictable growing seasons. At Jorvik in York, England, excavations have uncovered seeds, pollen, and preserved plant remains that paint a picture of Viking farmers who were far more innovative than history books suggest. These weren't simple subsistence farmers scratching out a meager existence. They were plant breeders, soil managers, and food preservationists who developed techniques that allowed them to thrive in environments where lesser cultures would have starved. The Vikings understood something that modern agriculture has forgotten: that true food security comes not from importing exotic crops, but from developing deep relationships with the plants that can actually grow in your climate. Viking farms were organized around the concept of the infield and outfield system. The infield, close to the homestead, was intensively cultivated with manure and compost. Here grew the most valuable crops: barley, oats, and the precious vegetables that would sustain families through the long, dark months. The outfield extended further from the home, where livestock grazed and wild plants were harvested. But it was in the spaces between the edges of forests, the borders of fields, the sheltered spots near buildings, where the most interesting cultivation happened. Viking farmers were masters of what we now call permaculture, creating food systems that worked with natural patterns rather than against them. They understood microclimates in ways that would impress modern horticulturists. A south-facing stone wall could create a pocket of warmth where tender herbs might survive. A slight depression in the land could collect moisture and nutrients, perfect for water-loving plants. The Vikings read the landscape like a book, finding opportunity where others saw only obstacles. The women of Viking society were often the primary gardeners, and their knowledge was passed down through generations in ways that formal agriculture never recorded. They knew which plants could be interplanted for mutual benefit, which combinations would improve soil, and which varieties would store longest through winter. This knowledge was as valuable as any sword or shield because it was the foundation upon which Viking expansion was built. Consider the logistics of Viking exploration. When a group of settlers loaded their ships to establish new colonies in Iceland, Greenland, or North America, they couldn't rely on supply chains or grocery stores. They had to bring with them the genetic material, the seeds, cuttings, and root stocks that would allow them to recreate their food systems in entirely new environments. The success or failure of these expeditions often depended not on the strength of their warriors, but on the wisdom of their plant selections. The Vikings developed preservation techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. They understood fermentation, controlled drying, and cold storage in ways that allowed them to maintain nutritional variety throughout the year. Their root cellars were engineering marvels, designed to maintain consistent temperatures and humidity levels that would keep vegetables fresh for months. But perhaps most importantly, Viking farmers developed an intimate relationship with wild plants that modern agriculture has completely abandoned. They didn't see a sharp distinction between cultivated and wild foods. The forest edge, the meadow, the marshland, these were all part of their agricultural system. They actively managed wild plant populations, encouraging useful species and discouraging competitors through careful harvesting and selective burning. This integration of wild and cultivated plants created a food system of remarkable resilience. When one crop failed, others would succeed. When disease struck their barley, they had dozens of alternative plants to fall back on. When climate fluctuations made certain crops unviable, they could shift to wild alternatives that had co-evolved with the same environmental pressures. The Vikings also understood something that modern agriculture is only beginning to rediscover: that plant diversity is the key to both nutrition and survival. Their diets included hundreds of different plant species, each contributing unique nutrients, flavors, and medicinal properties. They didn't rely on a few high-yield crops, but on a complex web of plants that supported both human health and ecological stability. Yes, the Vikings were warriors, but more importantly, they were farmers. And among their crops were fruits and vegetables so well adapted to their cold, rugged world, they became staples for survival, until time forgot them. Today, we journey back into the forgotten gardens of the Viking Age, uncovering the lost produce that once fed a people and then disappeared. Growing wild across the tundra and marshlands of the north, the cloudberry was gold to Viking farmers, not just for its amber color, but for its life-saving nutrients. The cloudberry, known scientifically as Rubus commemoris, was perhaps the most prized wild fruit in the Viking world. In the harsh northern climate where citrus fruits were unknown and vegetables were scarce through the long winter months, this humble berry was literally a matter of life and death. Rich in vitamin C, cloudberries were a powerful weapon against scurvy. In fact, sagas hint at warriors and settlers carrying preserved cloudberries on long voyages, dried or made into dense pastes. The Icelandic sagas speak of chieftains who would reward their most loyal followers with stores of cloudberry preserves, understanding that these golden fruits were worth more than silver in the depths of winter. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements shows that cloudberry seeds and remains are consistently found in the refuse pits and storage areas of even the most remote outposts. This suggests that cloudberries weren't just a seasonal treat, but a carefully managed and preserved resource that was essential to survival. The Viking relationship with cloudberries went far beyond simple foraging. They developed sophisticated techniques for managing wild cloudberry populations, understanding that these plants required very specific conditions to thrive. Cloudberries grow in acidic, boggy soils and need both male and female plants to produce fruit. The Vikings learned to identify and protect these delicate ecosystems, sometimes even moving stones and adjusting water flow to create better growing conditions. Viking women, especially in Iceland and Norway, managed berry patches close to settlements. These weren't cultivated in the modern sense, but rather carefully tended wild populations that were integrated into the broader agricultural system. Women would mark the best-producing plants, clear competing vegetation, and create paths that allowed for efficient harvesting without damaging the fragile root systems. The timing of cloudberry harvest was crucial and required intimate knowledge of local weather patterns. The berries ripen for only a few weeks in midsummer, and the timing varies dramatically with elevation, latitude, and local climate conditions. Viking communities developed complex social protocols around cloudberry harvesting, ensuring that everyone had access to these vital nutrients while preventing overexploitation that could damage future harvests. Cloudberry bushes were low maintenance, thriving in boggy soils where other crops failed. But this apparent simplicity masked a deep understanding of Arctic ecology. The Vikings knew that cloudberries were part of a complex web of relationships with other plants, insects, and soil microorganisms. They understood that the health of cloudberry populations was tied to the health of the entire bog ecosystem. They were eaten fresh in midsummer, providing a burst of vitamin C and antioxidants just when the body needed them most after months of preserved foods. But the real value of cloudberries lay in their preservation potential. Viking food preservation techniques were sophisticated enough to maintain the nutritional value of cloudberries throughout the winter months when fresh food was scarce. The most common preservation method was to boil cloudberries with honey into dense, concentrated paste that could be stored in sealed containers. These cloudberry preserves were incredibly nutritious, containing not just vitamin C, but also vitamin A, vitamin E, and numerous antioxidants that helped prevent the nutritional deficiencies that plagued other medieval populations. Vikings also developed techniques for drying cloudberries into leather-like sheets that could be stored for years without spoiling. These dried cloudberry preparations were essential provisions for long sea voyages, providing sailors with the nutrients they needed to prevent scurvy during months at sea. The leaves of cloudberry plants were even steeped into medicinal teas that were used to treat everything from digestive problems to respiratory ailments. Viking healers understood that the entire plant had value, not just the fruit. The roots were sometimes used in poultices for wounds, and the leaves were burned as incense during religious ceremonies. Cloudberries also played an important role in Viking trade networks. Communities that had access to particularly productive cloudberry bogs could trade preserved berries for goods that weren't available locally. This trade helped spread knowledge about preservation techniques and created connections between settlements that might otherwise have remained isolated. The spiritual significance of cloudberries in Viking culture cannot be overlooked. These golden berries, appearing briefly in the endless light of the Arctic summer, were seen as gifts from the gods. They were often included in ritual feasts and were considered essential foods for warriors preparing for battle. So what happened? With urbanization and the drainage of wetlands, their natural habitat shrank. Meanwhile, imported citrus fruits pushed aside the humble northern berry. The Industrial Revolution brought not just new foods, but new attitudes toward food that valued convenience and shelf life over nutrition and local adaptation. The complex traditional knowledge required to successfully harvest and preserve cloudberries was lost as people moved to cities and lost their connection to the land. The seasonal rhythms and ecological understanding that had allowed Vikings to thrive on cloudberries for centuries became irrelevant in a world where food could be shipped from anywhere at any time. Today, cloudberries are a rare delicacy, expensive, hard to find, and mostly forgotten. They still grow wild in the same bogs and tundra where Vikings once harvested them, but the knowledge of how to find them, when to harvest them, and how to preserve them has largely disappeared. A fruit that once sustained entire civilizations has become a curiosity, available only to those wealthy enough to afford its high price in specialty markets. Imagine a fruit-scented vegetable that looks like fennel, smells like anise, and tastes like melon mixed with parsley. That was muskroot, also called sweet Sicily, a soft-stemmed perennial that thrived in Viking herb gardens. Myris odorata, known to the Vikings as muskroot or sweet Sicily, occupied a unique position in Norse agriculture that modern food systems have no equivalent for. This remarkable plant blurred the lines between vegetable, fruit, spice, and medicine in ways that perfectly suited the Viking approach to holistic food production. While not a fruit by modern standards, its sweet, juicy roots and fragrant seeds filled a similar role in Viking cuisine and culture. The entire plant was edible and useful, from its delicate fern-like leaves to its thick, aromatic roots. This wasn't simply a matter of using whatever was available. Muskroot was deliberately cultivated because it provided such a wide range of flavors and functions from a single, hardy plant. The Vikings recognized muskroot as one of the few plants that could provide genuine sweetness in their harsh northern climate. Before the introduction of sugar from warmer regions, sources of sweetness were precious and rare. Honey was available, but expensive and limited. Tree fruits were scarce and often too tart to satisfy the human craving for sweet flavors. Muskroot filled this crucial gap, providing a natural sweetness that could be harvested from early spring through late fall. The cultivation of muskroot required sophisticated understanding of plant biology and soil management. Unlike many herbs that prefer dry, sunny conditions, muskroot thrived in the cool, moist environments that were common in Viking territories. It preferred partial shade and rich, well-drained soil that retained moisture without becoming waterlogged. Viking gardeners learned to create these conditions through careful site selection and soil amendment. The plant's perennial nature made it particularly valuable in Viking agricultural systems. Once established, a muskroot plant could provide food and medicine for decades with minimal care. This long-term thinking was characteristic of Viking farming practices, which prioritized sustainability and resource efficiency over short-term yields. Vikings candied the roots with honey and chewed the seeds after meals for digestion. The process of candying muskroot was a complex art that required precise timing and temperature control. The roots were harvested in late fall when their sugar content was highest, then slowly cooked in honey until they became translucent and preserved. This candied muskroot was not just a sweet treat, but a concentrated source of nutrients that could be stored throughout the winter. The seeds of muskroot provided a different kind of value. When chewed fresh, they released a burst of anise-like flavor that was both refreshing and digestive. Viking healers understood that these seeds contained compounds that could settle upset stomachs, reduce bloating, and improve overall digestive health. The practice of chewing muskroot seeds after meals was both medicinal and social, creating a communal ritual that marked the end of shared meals. Muskroot was especially beloved by children, who treated its tender stalks like natural candy. The hollow stems could be harvested throughout the growing season and eaten raw, providing a sweet, crunchy snack that was both nutritious and satisfying. This made muskroot an important component of child nutrition in Viking society, where keeping children healthy and well-fed was essential for community survival. The plant's ability to thrive in shaded conditions made it perfect for Viking garden design. It flourished in shaded garden plots, often near doorways and wells, where it could take advantage of the higher moisture levels and protection from harsh winds. This strategic placement also made it easily accessible for daily harvesting, whether for cooking, medicine, or simple snacking. Viking women were the primary cultivators of muskroot, passing down knowledge about its cultivation and uses through generations of oral tradition. They understood the subtle signs that indicated when different parts of the plant were ready for harvest, when the roots had reached peak sweetness, and how to process and preserve the various plant parts for maximum nutrition and flavor. The medicinal applications of muskroot were extensive and well documented in Viking healing traditions. The leaves were used to make poultices for wounds and skin irritations, taking advantage of the plant's natural antiseptic properties. The roots were prepared as teas for digestive problems, respiratory ailments, and women's health issues. The seeds were used to treat everything from bad breath to serious digestive disorders. Muskroot also played an important role in Viking brewing and fermentation practices. The leaves and seeds were sometimes added to fermented beverages to provide flavor and preserve the drink. The natural antimicrobial compounds in muskroot helped prevent spoilage and added complex flavors that complemented the grain-based alcoholic beverages that were central to Viking social life. The plant's sweet fragrance made it valuable for more than just food and medicine. Viking homes often had bundles of dried muskroot hanging from the rafters, providing natural air freshening and insect repellent properties. The pleasant scent was particularly welcome during the long winter months when homes were sealed against the cold and fresh air was scarce. As Viking society evolved and trade networks expanded, muskroot began to face competition from imported spices and sweeteners. The introduction of sugar from warmer climates made the labor-intensive process of candying muskroot roots seem less worthwhile. Exotic spices from distant lands provided new flavors that seemed more exciting than the familiar taste of muskroot. But as sugar imports increased in medieval Europe, sweet Sicily was pushed aside. Its unique flavor was considered old-fashioned, and it vanished from culinary traditions. The complex knowledge required to cultivate, harvest, and process muskroot was gradually lost as people became more dependent on imported foods and less connected to local plant resources. The decline of muskroot cultivation represented more than just the loss of a single plant species. It marked the beginning of a fundamental shift away from integrated, sustainable food systems toward the specialized, import-dependent agriculture that characterizes modern food production. The Vikings' holistic approach to plant use, where every part of every plant had value and purpose, was replaced by a more narrow focus on single-purpose crops and processed foods. The social and cultural functions of muskroot were also lost in this transition. The plant had been deeply integrated into Viking daily life, from the children who snacked on its stems to the healers who used its roots in medicine. Its disappearance represented the loss of connections between people and plants that had sustained northern European communities for centuries. Today, muskroot grows wild on a few Scandinavian hillsides, unrecognized by most, a forgotten treat from a time when Vikings turned herbs into dessert. Modern foragers occasionally stumble upon these remnant populations, but without the traditional knowledge of how to identify, harvest, and use the plant, most people pass by without recognizing its value. The few remaining patches of wild muskroot serve as living reminders of what was lost when traditional food systems were abandoned in favor of industrial agriculture. These plants continue to thrive in the same conditions where Vikings once cultivated them, proof that the knowledge and techniques developed over centuries of careful observation and experimentation were both sophisticated and sustainable. Before apples and citrus took over the fruit world, gooseberries were a staple across Viking homesteads. These tart green or purple berries were cultivated in small hedgerows, often trained along fences or near forest edges. The gooseberry, known scientifically as Ribes uvicrispa, represented one of the most successful examples of Viking agricultural innovation. These hardy shrubs were not simply foraged from the wild, but were actively cultivated, bred, and managed in ways that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of plant genetics and horticultural techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by European agriculture for centuries. Viking gooseberry cultivation was a complex system that integrated fruit production with landscape management, home security, and ecological sustainability. The thorny nature of gooseberry bushes made them ideal for creating living barriers around homesteads, providing both protection and food production in a single system. These hedgerows served multiple functions simultaneously, demonstrating the Viking genius for creating agricultural systems that maximized efficiency while minimizing labor. The strategic placement of gooseberry bushes around Viking settlements was no accident. They were typically planted along property boundaries, near animal enclosures, and around vegetable gardens where their thorny branches could deter both human intruders and hungry wildlife. This integration of security and food production was characteristic of Viking agricultural thinking, which always sought to create systems that served multiple purposes. They were favored for their resilience, tolerating frost, shallow soil, and poor sunlight conditions that would defeat most other fruit crops. This hardiness made gooseberries perfect for the unpredictable climate of Scandinavia, where late frosts could destroy tender fruit blossoms and thin soils challenged the growth of more demanding crops. Viking farmers learned to work with these challenging conditions rather than against them, selecting plants that could thrive in the environments they actually had rather than the environments they wished they had. The ability of gooseberries to produce fruit in partial shade was particularly valuable in Viking agricultural systems. Many homesteads were located in areas where tall trees or rocky outcroppings created areas of reduced sunlight that were unsuitable for grain crops or sun-loving vegetables. Gooseberries could turn these marginal spaces into productive fruit-growing areas, maximizing the use of available land in a way that modern agriculture has largely forgotten. Gooseberries provided fresh fruit in summer, offering a burst of vitamin C and tartness that was both refreshing and nutritious. The timing of gooseberry harvest was crucial, as the berries could be picked at different stages of ripeness for different purposes. Unripe green berries were prized for their extreme tartness and were often used in cooking applications where their acidity could brighten heavy, fatty dishes. Fully ripe berries were sweeter and could be eaten fresh or used in fermented beverages. The preservation potential of gooseberries was extraordinary, and Viking food preservation techniques were perfectly suited to take advantage of this. When preserved in honey or vinegar, gooseberries became a source of flavor and nutrition that could last throughout the year. The natural acidity of gooseberries made them ideal for fermentation and pickling, creating preserved foods that were both nutritious and flavorful. Viking preservation methods for gooseberries were surprisingly sophisticated. They understood that different preservation techniques would result in different flavors and nutritional profiles. Gooseberries preserved in honey retained more of their natural fruit character and provided concentrated energy, while those preserved in vinegar became more like condiments that could enhance other foods. Some were dried into fruit leathers that could be stored for years without spoiling. The medicinal applications of gooseberries were extensive and well documented in Viking healing traditions. They had medicinal value, with Viking healers using them for treating fevers and digestive problems. The high vitamin C content made them valuable for preventing scurvy, while their natural astringency was useful for treating diarrhea and other digestive ailments. The leaves of gooseberry plants were sometimes used to make medicinal teas, and the thorns were occasionally used in primitive surgical procedures. The integration of gooseberry cultivation with other agricultural activities demonstrated the sophistication of Viking farming systems. Gooseberry bushes were often planted near composting areas where they could benefit from the rich nutrients while helping to contain and manage organic waste. They were also integrated with animal husbandry, providing shelter for small livestock while benefiting from the natural fertilization provided by animal manure. By the late Viking Age, hybrid varieties were being selected, early evidence of what we now call plant breeding. This represented a remarkable achievement in agricultural science, as the Vikings were consciously selecting and breeding plants for specific characteristics centuries before the formal development of scientific plant breeding techniques. They understood that plants with desirable traits could be propagated and that crossing different varieties might result in offspring with improved characteristics. The Viking approach to gooseberry breeding was based on careful observation and selection over multiple generations. They would identify plants that produced larger berries, had better flavor, showed greater disease resistance, or ripened at more convenient times. Seeds from these superior plants would be saved and planted, gradually improving the overall quality of their gooseberry populations. This selective breeding work was primarily carried out by women, who had primary responsibility for garden management and food production. Their knowledge of plant characteristics and breeding techniques was passed down through generations of mothers and daughters, creating a sophisticated body of agricultural knowledge that was every bit as valuable as the more celebrated male skills of warfare and craftsmanship. The social and cultural significance of gooseberries in Viking society extended beyond their practical value as food and medicine. Gooseberry harvest was a communal activity that brought families and communities together. The thorny nature of the bushes made harvesting a challenging task that was often shared among multiple people, creating opportunities for social interaction and knowledge sharing. Gooseberries were one of the few fruits that Vikings actively improved through selective breeding and cultivation techniques. This improvement work required patience, observation, and a deep understanding of plant biology that demonstrated the sophisticated agricultural knowledge that existed in Viking society. The varieties they developed were specifically adapted to Northern European growing conditions and were far better suited to local climates than the imported varieties that would later replace them. The decline of gooseberry cultivation represented a significant loss for Northern European agriculture. So why don't we eat them today? Gooseberries fell victim to a combination of colonial crops and modern pests. American mildew devastated European varieties in the 1800s, wiping out centuries of careful breeding work in just a few decades. The introduction of this fungal disease from North America destroyed most of the traditional gooseberry varieties that had been developed over generations of Viking and post-Viking cultivation. The arrival of sweeter imported fruits from warmer climates also contributed to the decline of gooseberries. Apples, pears, and eventually citrus fruits provided sweetness without the tartness that characterized gooseberries. As trade networks expanded and transportation improved, these imported fruits became more available and affordable, gradually displacing the hardy northern fruits that had sustained communities for centuries. Now gooseberries are considered old-fashioned, relegated to the gardens of a few enthusiasts who appreciate their unique flavor and historical significance. But once, they were essential components of Northern European food systems, providing nutrition, medicine, and security in an integrated agricultural system that modern farming has never been able to replicate. The few remaining gooseberry varieties that survive today are pale shadows of the diversity that once existed. The hundreds of local varieties that were developed through centuries of careful selection and breeding have been reduced to a handful of commercial cultivars that prioritize shipping and storage over flavor and nutrition. The loss of this genetic diversity represents not just the disappearance of food options, but the loss of centuries of accumulated agricultural wisdom and adaptation to local growing conditions. In the sunniest corners of Viking farmsteads, two quiet legends once grew: the field pea and the wild apple. The field pea, known scientifically as Pisum arvense, was perhaps the most underappreciated cornerstone of Viking civilization. These small, hardy legumes were among the earliest cultivated crops in the Norse world, and their importance to Viking society cannot be overstated. Unlike the large, sweet garden peas that grace modern tables, Viking field peas were small, dense, and packed with protein that could sustain communities through the harshest winters. Field peas were small, hardy, and full of protein. They were vital in lean months when other food sources had been exhausted. The protein content of field peas was particularly crucial in Viking diets, which were often lacking in complete proteins during the long winter months when fresh meat was scarce and preserved meats had been consumed. These legumes provided essential amino acids that complemented the grain-based staples that formed the foundation of Viking nutrition. The cultivation of field peas demonstrated the Vikings' sophisticated understanding of soil science and sustainable agriculture. They recognized that peas, like all legumes, had the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere through their relationship with beneficial soil bacteria. This nitrogen fixation improved soil fertility for subsequent crops, making field peas an essential component of Viking crop rotation systems that maintained soil health without external inputs. Viking farmers developed complex intercropping systems that maximized the benefits of field pea cultivation. Peas were often grown alongside barley or oats, with the legumes providing nitrogen that improved grain yields while the grains provided physical support for the climbing pea vines. This integration of crops demonstrated an ecological understanding that modern agriculture is only beginning to rediscover. The timing of field pea planting was crucial and required intimate knowledge of local climate patterns. Viking farmers learned to plant peas as early as possible in the spring, taking advantage of the plant's ability to tolerate light frosts while ensuring they would mature before the intense heat of midsummer. This precise timing was passed down through generations of farmers who understood that a few days' difference in planting could mean the difference between a successful harvest and crop failure. Boiled into pottages, mashed, or even fermented into proto-beer, field peas were processed in numerous ways that maximized their nutritional value and extended their storage life. The most common preparation was as a thick porridge or stew that combined peas with whatever other ingredients were available. This pea porridge was a staple food that could be prepared quickly and provided substantial nutrition for working families. The fermentation of field peas into alcoholic beverages represented one of the most sophisticated food processing techniques in Viking culture. This process not only preserved the nutritional value of the peas, but also created beverages that were safer to drink than water in many circumstances. The fermentation process also enhanced the bioavailability of nutrients, making the proteins and vitamins in the peas more easily absorbed by the human body. Viking preservation techniques for field peas were remarkably effective and allowed communities to store protein-rich foods for years without spoilage. Dried peas could be stored in sealed containers or underground storage pits where they would remain viable for multiple seasons. This long-term storage capability was essential for surviving the unpredictable harvests that characterized northern European agriculture. The processing of field peas into flour was another important technique that expanded their culinary applications. Pea flour could be mixed with grain flours to create more nutritious breads and flatbreads, or it could be used to thicken soups and stews. This versatility made field peas an essential ingredient in Viking cooking, providing both protein and functional properties that improve the texture and nutritional value of other foods. And then there were apples. Not the large, sweet ones we know today, but wild, crabapple-sized fruits with tart skins and dense flesh that represented the northern European apple varieties that had evolved over thousands of years to survive in harsh climates. These ancient apples bore little resemblance to the large, sweet fruits that dominate modern markets. They were typically small, rarely larger than a golf ball, with thick skins that protected the fruit from frost and disease. The flesh was dense and often quite tart, with a complex flavor profile that combined sweetness with astringency in ways that modern apple varieties have been bred to eliminate. Archaeological digs at Norse farms in Sweden and Denmark have uncovered apple pits near hearths, showing they were eaten raw, cooked, or pressed into juice. These archaeological findings provide concrete evidence that apples were not just occasional wild foods, but were integrated into daily Viking life. The presence of apple remains in cooking areas suggests that these fruits were processed and prepared in various ways, not simply eaten fresh. The cultivation of apples in Viking settlements required considerable knowledge of grafting and tree management techniques. While some apples were gathered from wild trees, evidence suggests that Vikings also maintained managed orchards where they selected and propagated trees that produced superior fruit. This work required patience and skill, as apple trees take several years to mature and begin producing fruit. The processing of apples into juice and fermented beverages was a sophisticated operation that required specialized equipment and knowledge. Viking communities developed techniques for pressing apples to extract juice, which could then be fermented into alcoholic beverages or concentrated into syrups that could be stored for long periods. These apple-based beverages were not only nutritious, but also provided a source of alcohol that was essential for social and religious activities. The medicinal applications of apples were extensive and well documented in Viking healing traditions. The bark of apple trees was used to treat fevers and digestive problems, while the fruit itself was prescribed for various ailments. The high pectin content of these ancient apples made them particularly valuable for treating digestive disorders, while their natural acids helped prevent scurvy during the long winter months. The integration of apple cultivation with other agricultural activities demonstrated the efficiency of Viking farming systems. Apple trees were often planted near homesteads where they could provide shade and wind protection while producing fruit. The fallen leaves from apple trees were used as mulch and compost, while the wood from prune branches was valued for smoking meats and making tools. The varieties of apples cultivated by Vikings were specifically adapted to northern European growing conditions and could survive temperatures and weather conditions that would kill modern apple varieties. These hardy trees had developed natural resistance to diseases and pests through centuries of evolution in harsh climates. The genetic diversity represented by these ancient apple varieties was enormous, with each region developing its own locally adapted strains. The decline of traditional apple varieties began with the introduction of grafted varieties from warmer climates that promised larger, sweeter fruit. Over time, these varieties vanished, replaced by grafted apple types from warmer climates that required more intensive management and were less adapted to northern European conditions. The process of replacing locally adapted varieties with imported ones was gradual but relentless, driven by changing tastes and commercial pressures. Field peas were similarly displaced by more productive legumes that were introduced from other regions. While these new varieties might have produced higher yields under ideal conditions, they lacked the resilience and climate adaptation that had made field peas so valuable in Viking agriculture. The shift toward higher yielding but less resilient crops represented a fundamental change in agricultural philosophy that prioritized short-term productivity over long-term sustainability. The loss of these traditional varieties represented more than just the disappearance of specific crops. Both faded from gardens and memory as the knowledge required to cultivate and use them was lost. The complex techniques for processing field peas into various food products were forgotten as communities became more dependent on imported foods and less connected to local agricultural traditions. What we lost wasn't just food, it was independence. The ability to grow your own protein and fruit without relying on imports or monocultures represented a form of food security that modern agriculture has never been able to replicate. The Vikings' integrated approach to food production, where every plant served multiple purposes and every technique was adapted to local conditions, created a resilient food system that could survive disruptions that would devastate modern agriculture. The genetic diversity that was lost with the disappearance of traditional field peas and ancient apples represents an irreplaceable resource that took centuries to develop. These varieties contain genetic traits that allowed them to thrive in challenging conditions, resist diseases, and provide nutrition under circumstances where modern varieties would fail. The loss of this genetic heritage has left modern agriculture vulnerable to climate change and emerging diseases in ways that Viking farmers never experienced. The social and cultural significance of these crops extended far beyond their practical value as food sources. The cultivation of field peas and apples was deeply integrated into Viking seasonal rhythms and community life. The timing of planting, tending, and harvesting these crops created social opportunities and reinforced community bonds that were essential for survival in harsh northern climates. Today, remnants of these ancient varieties can occasionally be found in abandoned orchards or wild places where they have survived without human intervention. These surviving plants serve as living reminders of what was lost when traditional food systems were abandoned in favor of industrial agriculture. They represent not just genetic resources, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations of farmers who understood how to work with nature rather than against it. The Viking world wasn't just made of steel and storm. It was also built on soil, seed, and season. From cloudberries and gooseberries to wild apples and candied muskroots, Norse farmers cultivated a resilient, hyperlocal food system that responded to the land, not against it. This agricultural philosophy represented a fundamentally different approach to food production than what characterizes modern agriculture. Where contemporary farming seeks to impose uniform conditions and maximize yields from standardized crops, Viking agriculture embraced diversity, adapted to local conditions, and prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term productivity. The genius of Viking agricultural systems lay not in their ability to produce massive quantities of food, but in their remarkable resilience and adaptability. These systems were designed to function in unpredictable climates with variable growing seasons, poor soils, and limited resources. They succeeded not by controlling nature, but by working with natural processes to create food systems that could survive and thrive under conditions that would defeat more rigid agricultural approaches. The integration of wild and cultivated foods was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Viking agriculture. They understood that the boundary between wild and domestic was artificial and counterproductive. Their food systems included hundreds of species that range from fully domesticated crops to completely wild plants, with many species occupying intermediate positions that modern agriculture has no equivalent for. This diversity provided both nutritional variety and insurance against crop failures that could devastate more specialized systems. Viking farmers developed an intimate understanding of ecological relationships that allowed them to create food systems that were largely self-sustaining. They knew which plants could be grown together for mutual benefit, which combinations would improve soil fertility, and how to manage landscapes to encourage beneficial species while discouraging pests and diseases. This knowledge was based on generations of careful observation and experimentation, creating a body of agricultural wisdom that was every bit as sophisticated as modern scientific agriculture. The seasonal rhythms of Viking agriculture were precisely calibrated to the natural cycles of northern European climates. They understood that successful farming required working with these cycles rather than against them, timing their activities to take advantage of natural processes while minimizing risks from weather and pests. This seasonal approach to agriculture created a rhythm of life that was deeply connected to the land and provided a sense of security and continuity that modern food systems cannot replicate. They didn't expect oranges from the north. They worked with what nature gave them, and in return, they survived for centuries in climates that would defeat most modern crops. This acceptance of local limitations was not a sign of primitiveness, but of wisdom. Viking farmers understood that attempting to grow crops that were unsuited to their climate was a waste of resources and energy. Instead, they focused on developing and perfecting plants that were naturally adapted to their conditions. The breeding and selection work carried out by Viking farmers was remarkable for its sophistication and long-term vision. They understood that improving crops was a multi-generational project that required patience, observation, and careful record-keeping. The varieties they developed were specifically adapted to local conditions and were often superior to modern varieties in terms of flavor, nutrition, and resistance to local pests and diseases. The processing and preservation techniques developed by Viking farmers were essential for survival in climates where fresh food was available for only a few months each year. These techniques were not primitive, but were highly refined methods that maximize nutrition while minimizing spoilage. The fermentation, drying, and storage methods they developed allowed them to maintain varied, nutritious diets throughout the year without relying on external inputs or energy sources. The social organization of Viking agriculture was based on cooperation and shared knowledge rather than competition and secrecy. Communities worked together to manage common resources, share labor during critical periods, and pass knowledge between generations. This collaborative approach created food systems that were more resilient and productive than what individual farmers could achieve working alone. The medicinal integration of food and healing was another sophisticated aspect of Viking agriculture. They understood that many plants served dual purposes as both food and medicine, and they cultivated and used plants with this integrated approach in mind. This holistic view of plant use meant that their food systems also provided health care, reducing the need for specialized medical treatments and creating a more comprehensive approach to human wellness. Today, many of those fruits and vegetables have vanished from our diets, replaced by high-yield, flavorless, globalized options that prioritize shipping and storage over nutrition and taste. The varieties that once sustained Viking communities have been lost not because they were inferior, but because they were incompatible with industrial agriculture's requirements for uniformity, mechanization, and global distribution. The loss of these traditional varieties represents more than just the disappearance of food options. It represents the loss of genetic diversity that took centuries to develop, the loss of agricultural knowledge that was refined over generations, and the loss of food systems that were sustainable and resilient in ways that modern agriculture has never been able to achieve. But some still survive, tucked away in seed banks, mountain villages, or wild places, waiting for curious hands to rediscover them. These surviving remnants of Viking agriculture represent hope for the future of food systems. They contain genetic resources that could be valuable for developing climate-resilient crops, traditional knowledge that could inform sustainable farming practices, and flavors that could enrich modern diets. The preservation of these traditional varieties and the knowledge associated with them is not just a matter of historical interest, but of practical importance for food security. As climate change makes growing conditions more unpredictable and as industrial agriculture faces increasing challenges from pests, diseases, and soil degradation, the resilience and adaptability of traditional food systems becomes increasingly relevant. The rediscovery of Viking agricultural practices could also provide solutions to modern problems of nutrition and health. The diverse diets that characterize Viking communities provided a range of nutrients that are often lacking in modern diets based on a small number of highly processed foods. The fermentation and preservation techniques they developed could provide alternatives to industrial food processing that rely on chemical additives and energy-intensive methods. So next time you walk through a grocery store, think about what isn't there and how the Vikings might have fed a village with plants we've long since forgotten. The aisles of identical produce, the processed foods with ingredient lists that read like chemistry experiments, the fruits and vegetables that look perfect but taste like water, all of this represents a food system that has prioritized efficiency and profit over nutrition, flavor, and sustainability. The contrast between modern supermarkets and Viking food systems is stark and instructive. Where we have variety in packaging and branding, they had variety in actual food. Where we have foods that can be shipped around the world, they had foods that were perfectly adapted to local conditions. Where we have foods that last for months on shelves, they had foods that provided superior nutrition and flavor when consumed fresh or properly preserved. The Viking approach to food production offers lessons that are increasingly relevant as modern agriculture faces challenges from climate change, soil degradation, and loss of genetic diversity. Their emphasis on local adaptation, ecological integration, and long-term sustainability provides a model for developing food systems that are both productive and resilient. The rediscovery of Viking agricultural wisdom doesn't mean returning to medieval technology or abandoning modern scientific knowledge. Instead, it means learning from the successes of traditional food systems and applying those lessons to contemporary challenges. It means recognizing that the pursuit of ever higher yields and ever greater efficiency may have come at the cost of resilience, nutrition, and sustainability. The forgotten fruits and vegetables of Viking agriculture represent more than just lost food options. They represent a different way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the natural world, a way of thinking that prioritized adaptation over control, diversity over uniformity, and sustainability over short-term gain. As we face the challenges of feeding a growing global population in an era of climate change and resource scarcity, the wisdom of Viking farmers offers valuable insights that could help create food systems that are both productive and sustainable.